So at CyberDuck, we deliver digital transformation powered by user-centered design and creative web technologies. We've always been UX focused and focused on designing products for the end user through a lot of research and testing. So we have an accredited approach, and we deliver brands, websites, and systems that are really well researched and perform exceptionally every time. We become an extension of our clients' teams. We've been going for 13 years. We work a lot with the financial service industry, insurance, automotive, technology companies, publishing, pharmaceutical, and a few others. We've got sort of over 50 staff now. Yeah, we love what we do. Just a bit about me. My name's Danny Bluestone. So I've been running CyberDuck now for over 13 years. And one of the things that really excited me culturally was going to the Science Museum and taking a sort of data test. Has anyone taken that data test before? One hand I saw. It was really fun. I think they took the installation down, but essentially what you did is you went up to a kiosk and it scored your attitude to data. And I did it with my wife, and actually what we found were two very different results. So I'm on the left-hand side, and I'm called a data liberator. So I'm really up for a big data revolution, and I think that being liberal with data will help to transform the world, whereas my wife is a privacy protector, and she wants to protect data at all costs, and that's her sort of personal data. So it's just quite interesting to see that kind of polarized results. And today, I guess, users provide their data to so many different services. So for example, this is my genetic data. So I'm obviously trusting 23andMe to hold my personal data. And every single pound that we earn now, it goes into bank accounts, it goes into loan websites. So they hold all of this really confidential information on us, whether it's financial, genetic, healthcare, and stuff like that. And the big question here is, the users trust the brands to hold their website, and do the brands themselves have the confidence that they can safeguard the users' data? So that's the question. So GDPR is here to sort of help, but I guess the challenges that the world have to do with the amount of data in digital is just unparalleled. I mean, if you look at the time spent now sort of watching box sets online, they all track what we watch. And then all the shopping now is online, so there's so much e-commerce data. I was chatting to someone from an e-commerce company here earlier. Digital music, everything is online. Video that people buy now, it's all digital. Consumer spending, everything is data. And I think the problem is that brands know more about us than we know about ourselves. So like on social networks and stuff, they really do know so much about us. In one example, so using something called a subject information request, a Tinder user, a journalist from The Guardian actually, asked for Tinder to send her the information that Tinder has on her. And they had over 800 pages, A4 pages of information about her kind of browsing habits on the Tinder website. So that's incredible, including the age rank, where she clicked on or swiped on the profiles, whether she did it from work or from home, how many Facebook friends she has. It's just absolutely phenomenal. And there are sort of moral arguments about all of this data. The data is so important, but in this example here, a Danish graduate took all of OkCupid's database, which was 70,000 records, and published everything online, basically. So, who's responsible for safeguarding that data? Is it OkCupid? Is he responsible as an individual? And he basically argued that the data was already public in the first place, even though he had to log in and arguably scrape all of that data out of there. And I guess the businesses really know what they're doing. So 49% of businesses have had a document breach in the past 2 years. 73% of employees are accidentally exposing information, and 65% of staff are unable to locate sensitive data. So there is a big problem, and I think that, again, this is where GDPR can really help. So GDPR built on prior EU directives and the UK Data Protection Act and other local ones. And essentially it's about making, the big difference is now, is it's about making organizations accountable, and data processors are also accountable, whereas before they weren't. And it's about taking a risk-based approach to data and implementing something called privacy by design from the outset. And the users essentially gain, or supposed to get, much higher levels of transparency and consent, and have something called the rights of erasure, where their data can be deleted, and data portability, where they can port their data from one service to another service. So in a way, it's a bit like Thomas the Tank Engine, where the fact controller determines the purposes and means of processing the personal data. And obviously a data controller has the legal responsibility to also appoint qualified data processors. So they actually now, have to, if you're a data controller or a brand that, collects data, you're legally obliged to find qualified processors now that follow the same sort of processes that you do. So in other words, the processor will process the data for the controller, and they need to conform to the processes. They need to also be subject to the same audits that the controller has, or the controller can demand an audit on the processor. And they need to have kind of breach procedures. If they do have a data breach, they need to notify ICO as well, whereas in the past, it was only the controller that needed to do it. And they also need to have adequate backup and disaster recovery methods as well. So there's lots of documentation online about guidelines and principles. And what we've done at CyberDuck is we've boiled this down into 3 pillars, which is transparency is the first pillar. So the service must be clear, so that your website or product has to be clear. It has to be, any data that you collect has to be for specified purposes through explicit consent. And then you need to implement something called privacy by design. You need to have backup and disaster recovery methods to make sure there's integrity, and that you're resilient, and you use encryption and things like that. And you can't compromise users' identities, and you have to use things like, or can use things like anonymization and pseudonymization as well. And then you need to have controls, so that's policies, processes, procedures, to only collect the data that you really need, and ensure that the data is accessible by users so they can update their data. And you need to maintain retention policies as well. So I'm just going to cover sort of the transparency pillar. So the Financial Times sent something called a subject access request to various brands. And this is not a new thing. This has been going on since the data protection regulation, the prior sort of DPA. So users can do this already now, even before GDPR is being implemented, and ask for an organization to send them the data that they hold on them. But essentially they sent this to a couple of brands this month to see how they respond. And what they found is that Facebook, for example, didn't respond in 1 month, so they didn't respond to the letter that was sent, even though they legally need to respond. And when the journalists complained, all they did is referred them to a download your data button. Said, look, we don't need to respond. You can download that data about yourself from our website. Whereas Majestic Wine, who are a smaller retailer, responded in a timely manner. But now with GDPR, you need to do more than just send your customers their usernames and any data that you hold on them. You need to tell them how long you're going to be holding their data for. You need to give them data portability, and you need to allow them to erase all of their data from any backups that you have. Consent is a really important part of GDPR, and it's important that consent is unbundled and as granular as possible. There should be no opt-outs, so it's only about letting a user opt into things. And you need to ensure that a consent is easy to withdraw. Essentially, if someone gives you consent, they need to be able to change their mind and opt out. And you also need, as part of this kind of consent policy, you need to be able to name any third parties as well. So you can't just say, we will transfer your data to third parties. You have to name the third parties and let the users agree to that specifically. This is a good example of unbundled consent. So you can see that the terms and conditions are separated from the contact permission, but we think that this could be improved even further, where things like you should let the user select how they're going to be contacted. Should it be by phone, SMS, or other sort of electronic means as well? So there's lots of improvement that organisations can make to consent forms that are pretty good already, actually. Here's an example that's not good. So this is essentially, this particular website is making the user essentially opt out as opposed to opt in. So that's not cool. This is what audited consent looks like. So again, this is a key part of GDPR, where if you can see here, this is a digital pond opt-in. So there's clear kind of audit trail of when the user opted in. So again, it's within a CRM system. So it's easy to see that the user opted in. And that's the sort of record keeping that you need with GDPR. You need to be able to prove the consent. If you can't prove the consent, you probably want to delete that data or database. I mean, I have been speaking to different people, and organizations have literally deleted 70% of their database because they can't prove consent. So it's really important that you can prove consent. So privacy, this particular pillar is all about privacy by design, kind of data integrity, backups, and disaster recovery. So this is a story about a lady who she ordered food from Just Eat, and she was then harassed by the driver on WhatsApp. So it wasn't a fun experience. Normally her boyfriend answers the door, but he wasn't there. But essentially she complained after the guy sent inappropriate messages to her, which is quite sad. And then when she complained to Just Eat, they offered a £5 or £10 voucher, which wasn't enough really for the experience that she went through, because it really wasn't pleasant. These are just some of the messages. The tweet then went viral, and basically one of the directors from Just Eat called her to apologise in person. But I think these sort of problems can be mitigated if they would have created their own chat engine within the website or app. She wouldn't have needed to go onto WhatsApp to message the driver, who's probably a contractor anyway. So this is a better example from my Monzo app, where if I have any queries, like here I was in Berlin and I had a query about being billed twice, there's literally a function within the app that you can message someone, so you don't have to go into your phone or start messaging someone from another app. A lot of organisations, though, have to kind of continue to build new features, and one of them is Twitter. So what they're doing with their sort of consent is they're retrospectively building in kind of more controls. So, for example, I was quite surprised when I saw this, because basically I never selected this option, so it was kind of opt-in by default. So I should have really been the one that ticked that box. But essentially, what Twitter is doing here is it's personalizing my ads based on the apps that I have installed on my phone. So Twitter knows which apps I have and is then sending me personalized sort of advertising. Really what they should have done is emailed me, asked for my consent, and then got me to tick that box. So I just wanted to talk about this. So GDPR encourages anonymization and pseudonymization of data. Essentially what anonymization means is erasing personal data and replacing it with permanent fictitious values, whereas pseudonymization means replacing identifiable data with a persistent and reversible token. So in this example here, you can see that Johnny is identifiable through this AERT token. So whenever there's a reference to Johnny, they'll use that particular token. So what does this mean in the real world if you guys want to do this? Anonymization is useful when the granularity of data is not important and you don't need to revert back to the original records. So you can essentially really anonymize the data quite quickly. You don't have to worry about users being identified. Pseudonymization is useful if you want to masquerade the data and protect privacy, but need to go back to the original data at some point in time. So for example, you might want to masquerade the data to employees internally and only one person can kind of revert back the original data. So there's techniques like this that are quite good. So the Court of Justice in the EU has determined that IP addresses are personal data, or dynamic IP addresses are personal data in certain circumstances. It's essentially when the website operator has legal means of going back to the ISP in order to identify the individual. So it'd be interesting to hear sort of David's thoughts later. Essentially, with the cookies, it's kind of a madness that is just continuing and continuing. And, you know, there are two types of cookies. I'm assuming you all know sort of vaguely what a cookie is, but there's two types. There's cookies that are stored on a user's machine, which essentially are there for a functional purpose, like to allow the user to log in to a website or view their accounts. And then there's third sort of party reporting cookies. A good example is kind of Google Analytics, where essentially you're transferring kind of according to best practice, some sort of anonymized dynamic IP to Google through a cookie, and then Google is essentially tracking that IP across multiple websites. Under the prior cookie law, implied consent was enough. You just had to inform users, and you know, users would then come to a website. There would be, do you accept the cookies? And then you click accept. That was enough. Even though, according to my understanding, in the UK at least, nobody was ever sued for not having a cookie notice. Again, that's my understanding. But with GDPR, that's not going to cut it anymore, because you need to be able to opt out of cookies and provide or sort of reporting cookies. So users need to be able to opt out and then change their mind and opt back in. So it may change the user experiences that we have to deliver. So that's going to be quite interesting. I mean, if Google could deal with it on their end, of course that would be a lot easier for us, I guess, as brands and website owners. But if someone doesn't have a Google account, how do we get them to opt into all of Google's cookies? It's not really that simple. And the point is, I haven't really found a definitive answer on this matter. So I think, being sort of on the cautious side, I'd prefer to let users opt out of cookies on sort of websites. Another interesting point is about deleting data. So data subjects, they now have the right to obtain erasure from the data controller without any delay. So there's no 30-day kind of time lag here. They can approach you and you have to immediately delete the data. Again, that's according to the GDPR stuff. And that means deleting the data from backups as well. So if, for example, you're backing up to tapes, which a lot of organizations still do, that can become a headache. Like, imagine if your tape drive breaks down and then you have to buy a new tape drive to go through, 20 or 30 tapes. It is a headache to do that. So the privacy by design or privacy by default framework was created in Canada in the 1990s. So this is quite a few decades ago now. But the principles are very true today, and they're actually encouraged by GDPR itself. And it just I'm not going to read all of this out, but it basically says that privacy needs to be proactive. It needs to be the default setting. So again, you can apply that to sort of the cookie discussion. Privacy needs to be embedded into the design. It needs to be user-centric. It needs to be transparent. So these are really important principles. And I think this particular quote sums it up quite nicely. So with the implementation of GDPR and the principle of privacy by default, organizations can no longer hide behind the argument that they're technologically unable to act in line with regulations. So it is, really we can't really say that we don't have the technology now to deliver privacy by design, because we have to. At least that's what GDPR says. And obviously it's going to cost time and money, but it's just the way it is now. So the third pillar is control, and this is all about only collect the data that you really need to collect and make sure that it is accurate and accessible to users. Users need to be able to port the data out, and you have to have retention and data policies in place based on the statutory requirements, because obviously there's not only GDPR, there's other kind of laws and stuff to do with data that you need to respect. So this is when I log on to one of the banks, and it always asks me for my first school, for my date of birth, my first pet, when I had my first cup of coffee. It's bloody annoying. So it's collecting all of this data on me, and I just don't understand why. Whereas when I log on to this more modern online banking service, all I need to do is just use my Touch ID, and that's it, I'm in. It doesn't ask me for my date of birth. It doesn't ask me for so much data. So I think using things like two-factor authentication and biometric kind of widgets and stuff, we can get around this sort of thinking and really create sort of more modern products and services. And I think it's all about kind of the culture of the organization as well. So at CyberDuck we have data policies for everything from finance and HR records to the business operations records to the design and marketing deliverables. So any particular piece of data or asset that we create, we have retention guidelines. Obviously, finance and HR are very much kind of underpinned by things like HMRC guidelines, for example. But here, each record has a classification, and then we, depending on how old the data is, we have a different storage place, and then a different type of deletion. So if it's like physical data, we obviously destroy it. If it's digital data, it's a lot easier to destroy. So what is data portability? It's a concept to protect users from having their data stored in walled gardens. So just think about if you ever moved from an iPhone to an Android phone, or from an Android phone to an iPhone, you have ways to export your data and take it from one place to the other. This is what GDPR now is kind of mandating. I guess why do this? It helps users switch. It helps users to take their historical data. So for example, if you're going from Tesco to Sainsbury's, you might want to take all of your shopping cart with you. Yeah? And it also allows users to take their data out of these kind of walled websites and analyze their data, look at their data, see similar to what we saw with Tinder, where users can actually see, okay, what type of data does this organization have and hold? Another thing that's really important, and you need to remember with GDPR, is you need to be ready for data breaches or for hackers. That, for example, if someone hacks into your database and puts personal data online, you need to be ready to report it. So at CyberDuck we have a business continuity document and playbook which explains for different scenarios what you have to do. And one of the things that you need to do is you need to report any data breaches that affect personal users to the Information Commissioner Office. So there's a link on their website. So what I recommend you do is take that link and just sort of save it for, hopefully you will never need it, but just for a rainy day. But obviously there are other things that you need to do as well as report it to the ICO. And I think the other thing that's really important is to educate your staff. So once you have all of these policies and procedures in place, you really need to educate your staff. What we did at Cyberduck, and you'll find these handy business cards under your bums, but essentially it's a quiz about GDPR. So take that with you and test your knowledge. See how much you know about GDPR and if you're ready. So this is the final section now, and this is just really about where do you start with GDPR. So first of all, apply a process to your GDPR initiative. You normally want to do a data audit, find out consent levels internally. Look at your databases and look, how have you got the consent? Can you prove consent? Because if somebody complains, they're going to want to know when they gave their consent, and you're going to have to prove, either using your CRM or some sort of other querying tool, how you did that. Then conduct a gap analysis, so find out sort of what policies you have, whether your website is designed up to standard, whether you have those consents kind of tick boxes set up correctly on all your websites and apps. Make a plan and then start to implement and make all the changes, and then train everyone. How many people here have registered for an ICO certificate? So basically, it's if you collect personal data, it's a legal requirement for your organization. So someone in your organization is probably registered for this, and you may not be aware of it, but if you hold any personal information on users, you need to be, even staff, staff is also considered users as well. You have to be registered with the encryption as well. And be aware, because it's not only about GDPR, I'm sure this will be mentioned soon. There are other laws that you need to look at, like e-privacy, which is more business to business, and PSD2, which is an open banking kind of directive for financial services companies. So there are loads of things that the EU is doing besides GDPR. And then with consent, again, really, really important. You have to get explicit consent for everything. Don't combine consent together and say, put, a tick box. I'm happy to receive products, event information, and yearly newsletters. You need to separate everything out. Everything needs its own tick box. That is hugely important. And then be ready for subject access requests, so similar to what we saw with the journalist, because if someone sends you a subject access request, you need to be able to respond within 24 hours. That's how you need to know whether it's a legitimate access request and what the rules are around it. So thanks for listening. We'd be really happy to help you with any GDPR challenges around the design of your products and services. So we're working with a number of clients at the moment on this. The team from Cyberduck is me, Kaylee, Siji, Harry, and Christina. We're around, so do come and talk to us later on. Thanks.